There is a crucial truth many women overlook about what truly captures and holds a man's attention. It isn't about being more available. It isn't about being more agreeable or easier to be around. It isn't even about being the most interesting or physically striking woman in the room. What separates women who genuinely draw a man in from those who are simply acknowledged is something far more subtle and far more powerful. It's the ability to make him feel genuinely challenged in a way he hasn't felt before. It's knowing how to ask questions that move past the surface he presents to everyone else. It's understanding that real attraction grows when a man feels seen at a level he rarely allows. Before we go any further, I want you to pause for a moment and think honestly about your last few conversations with a man you were genuinely interested in. Not just what was said, but how it actually felt. Did it feel like something real was building between you? Or did it feel like you were both following a script you didn't even realize you were reading from? Because most women don't struggle because they lack warmth or effort. They struggle because the conversations they're having stay in a territory where nothing meaningful can actually grow. And here's the part that matters. If your conversations feel predictable, he already knows where it's going. And once he can predict you, he stops feeling you. Now imagine something different. Imagine sitting across from him, and instead of trying to hold his interest, you ask something that makes him stop. Not because he doesn't have an answer, but because no one has ever asked him that before. That pause, that moment where he looks at you differently, is where everything shifts. That's where interest becomes attention, and attention becomes curiosity. And curiosity becomes emotional investment that stays with him long after you've parted ways. My name is James Mercer, host of the Men's Mind YouTube channel, and what I'm about to share with you isn't about games, manipulation, or playing hard to get. It's about understanding the deeper psychology of how men actually connect, and why most interactions never reach that level. Because when you understand this, something changes in how you show up. You stop trying to be chosen, and you start naturally becoming someone worth choosing. Consider what most men experience every single day. They're approached constantly but rarely understood. They're asked about their work, their ambitions, their plans. They get the same questions in slightly different packaging. And after a while, something happens quietly underneath all of that. They learn to give the same answers. They develop a polished, surface-level version of themselves that functions in social situations without ever really revealing anything. Not because they're hiding, but because no one has ever given them a reason to go deeper. And this is exactly why most women find themselves frustrated. Not because the man isn't interesting, but because the conversation never reaches the place where his real self lives. They ask what he does. He answers. They ask where he's from. He answers. And the interaction stays in a place where genuine connection is simply not possible. Not because he doesn't want it, but because nothing in the exchange signaled that depth was welcome. But every once in a while, something different happens. He meets someone who doesn't follow the expected path. Someone who doesn't rush to fill silence with the next obvious question. Someone who asks something that makes him pause, genuinely pause, and feel something unexpected. That small shift, that moment where he steps off autopilot, is where real interest begins. That's where emotional attention forms without pressure. That's where he becomes present in a way he didn't anticipate. You see, attraction works on two levels simultaneously, the immediate and the lasting. And while most women focus on the immediate side, the lasting side is what creates depth, memory, and the kind of pull that doesn't fade. A man doesn't just become drawn to how a woman looks or how easy she is to talk to. He becomes drawn to how she makes him feel about himself, whether she challenges him without threatening him, whether she sees him beyond the role he usually plays. And here's where it becomes even more interesting. Men are not wired to remember conversations. They remember experiences. So when an interaction makes him feel something real, something he can't fully name but can't quite let go of either, that feeling stays. It comes back later when he's alone, and that's when attraction deepens, quietly, without anything obvious happening on the surface. That means the goal is not to say more. It's to ask what matters. Not to impress, but to reveal. Not to perform interest, but to create a space where something genuine can surface. And the most direct way to do that is through the right questions. Not polite questions. Not safe questions. Intentional questions that open doors he keeps closed in ordinary conversation. Because when you ask the right question, you're not just starting a conversation. You're creating an experience. You're signaling that you're paying attention at a level most people never reach. And that is rare. Much rarer than beauty, rarer than wit, rarer than status. Now, let's talk about what usually happens instead. Most women approach conversations like they're building a case, gathering information, filling in a profile. What does he do? Where did he grow up? Does he want kids someday? And there's nothing wrong with any of that. But when that becomes the framework, the interaction turns into an intake form. And while you're learning his biography, he's still wondering how it feels to be around you. Those are two completely different things. I once worked with someone who couldn't understand why men she was genuinely interested in never seemed to stay engaged past the first or second conversation. She was intelligent, warm, genuinely curious about people. But every time she reflected on what had been said, it was information, not experience. The conversations had covered ground without creating any feeling worth returning to. So I asked her to try something different. Instead of focusing on what she wanted to know about him, I asked her to focus on what he had probably never been asked. The next time she met someone she was interested in, she asked him one question he clearly hadn't expected. The conversation changed immediately. He slowed down. He thought before he answered. And when he did answer, it was something real, not the version he usually gave. Afterward, he messaged her to continue the conversation, not because she had impressed him, because she had reached him. That's what you're learning here. Not a script, a shift. Now, the 7 questions you're about to understand are not lines. They only work if your curiosity is genuine. If you ask them to create an effect, he'll sense it. But if you ask them because you actually want to understand who he is beneath the surface, something powerful happens. He relaxes in a way he doesn't usually allow himself to. And he begins to associate you with that rare feeling of being genuinely met. The first question is disarmingly simple, but what it unlocks is anything but. You ask him, what's something you used to be completely certain about that you've changed your mind on? And then you stop. Because this question does something most questions never do. It invites him to show growth rather than defend a position. It takes him off the script he usually runs and asks him to reflect on his own evolution. Men who appear confident and self-assured often carry a private relationship with doubt and change that they rarely get to voice. This question opens that door without forcing it. He might talk about a belief he held about success that life quietly dismantled. He might talk about how his understanding of relationships has shifted. He might go somewhere entirely unexpected, and as he answers, something subtle happens. He's no longer performing, he's actually thinking. And in that thinking, he becomes present with you in a way that didn't exist 30 seconds earlier. Here's where most women make the mistake. They respond immediately with their own version of the same answer. It feels natural, reciprocal even. But it breaks the moment. If instead you stay with his answer, if you let it land, if you allow a beat of silence before you respond, something different happens. He feels heard, not evaluated, not redirected, heard. And that is so uncommon for most men that it leaves an impression they can't quite explain. Think about what that does. In a world where most people are waiting for their turn to speak, you become the one who actually listened. And that is not a small thing. The second question moves into territory that most conversations never reach. You ask him, what does your life look like when you feel like you're actually living it, not just managing it? This question bypasses everything's surface. It doesn't ask about goals or plans. It asks about the gap between the life he has and the life he feels when he's most alive. And for most men, that gap is real and rarely spoken. He might describe something concrete, a particular kind of work, a specific environment, a feeling of flow he chases but doesn't always find. Or he might go quiet for a moment because the question revealed a distance he doesn't usually acknowledge out loud. And as he answers, something important happens. He reconnects with something he values that usually stays in the background. And because you're the one who brought him there, he begins to associate that feeling with you, quietly, without either of you naming it. This is where you go a level deeper instead of moving on. You stay. You might say, what gets in the way of that most? And suddenly the conversation is no longer an exchange. It's an unfolding, and if you're paying attention, you'll notice he's asking you questions too, not out of social obligation, but because something real has opened between you. Now I want you to reflect honestly. Are your conversations creating this kind of experience? Or are they covering ground without going anywhere? Because in the next part, we're going deeper into the remaining questions, the ones that reveal his inner compass, what drives him beneath the version he shows the world, and the places in himself he's still becoming. And once you understand how to reach those places with genuine curiosity, you won't just hold his attention. You'll become the kind of presence he finds himself returning to. Now here's where things shift even more deeply. Because once a man begins to open, once he feels that rare combination of safety and challenge, the next move is not to press forward. It's to guide the conversation into territory he doesn't usually enter with people. And this is where most women lose the thread. Either they become too careful and retreat back into safe, surface questions, or they push too hard and break the atmosphere entirely. But if you stay grounded here, if you remain genuinely curious without becoming an interviewer, this is where something real forms. The third question is one of the most direct paths into that shift. You ask him, if you could spend a year doing exactly what you wanted with no external pressure, what would that actually look like? There's almost always a pause after this one. Not hesitation, consideration, because most men have a version of this answer they've thought about privately, but rarely said out loud. Life conditions him to be practical, to frame his ambitions in terms of what's realistic. This question removes that filter and invites him to speak from something truer. He might describe something completely different from his current life. He might describe something surprisingly close to it, but with one or two things missing. He might reveal a version of himself that surprises even him when it comes out. And as he speaks, you'll often notice something change in his energy, more expression, more animation, sometimes a flash of something that looks like relief. Your role here is not to evaluate it, not to ask whether that's practical, not to redirect it towards something more grounded. You simply hold the space. Because what he's experiencing in that moment is not just the pleasure of imagining freedom, it's the experience of being trusted with his own desires. And when someone feels that kind of safety with you, it creates an imprint that doesn't fade easily. Let me give you a real scenario to make this concrete. A man once described a version of his life that looked almost nothing like the one he was living. Quieter, more creative, less driven by external markers of success. One woman immediately said, "You should go for it. Seriously, life is too short." The other simply said, "What do you think you'd feel like after a year of that?" The first response collapsed the moment into advice. The second kept him in the experience of exploring it. And that's the difference between a conversation he forgets and one he thinks about later. The fourth question moves into something more personal. You ask him, what's something you've worked hard to become that most people around you don't fully see? This question goes directly into the private relationship a man has with his own growth. The version of himself he's building quietly that doesn't always get acknowledged by the world around him. Most women ask what a man has achieved. You're asking who he's becoming, and that distinction reaches somewhere different. Because the men who are growing most significantly are often the ones who feel most unseen in that growth. He might talk about emotional work he's done that doesn't show up on the outside. He might describe a skill or quality he's developed that doesn't fit the image people have of him. He might simply sit with the question for a moment, because no one has asked him to account for his own becoming before. And when he answers whatever he says, something shifts. He's not performing. He's reflecting, and that is where the conversation stops being pleasant and starts being real. This is where trust forms, not through grand gestures, but through the quality of your attention. And again, your role here is not to validate or analyze. It's to listen, to be present, to allow him to say something out loud that he's been carrying quietly. Because when a man shares something like this, he's not just answering a question. He's handing you something. And how you hold it determines whether he continues opening up or slowly retreats. I want you to reflect on something for a moment. Think about the last time someone asked you a question that made you feel genuinely seen. Not evaluated, not redirected, but actually seen. That feeling is rare, and it stays. That's exactly what's happening for him right now. And that is what you're creating. The fifth question is where the conversation often becomes genuinely intimate. You ask him, what's something about you that usually takes people a long time to understand? He might tell you that people assume he's detached, when he's actually just selective about where he places his energy. Or that people see his confidence and miss the fact that he's harder on himself than anyone around him. Or that he's been carrying a version of himself in public that's real but incomplete. And this is the moment where your presence matters more than anything you could say. If you respond with lightness or try to normalize it too quickly, you break the atmosphere. But if you stay with him, if you acknowledge what he said in a simple, genuine way, that makes a lot of sense, or I can see why that would be hard to explain. Something settles. He doesn't need a complex response. He needs your presence. And that's enough. Most women, when they sense vulnerability, rush toward it. More warmth, more words, more reassurance. But this is exactly the moment to go still. You stay. You let what he said have weight. Because the woman who can hold that without flinching is the one he doesn't forget. The sixth question takes him somewhere that requires real reflection. You ask him, what has life taught you about people that you wish you'd understood earlier? As he answers this, you're not just gathering information. You're understanding his inner compass. You're seeing how experience has shaped the way he reads the world. Men who have lived through meaningful difficulty, professional failure, loss, betrayal, reinvention, carry a private wisdom that rarely gets invited into conversation. This question invites it He might talk about loyalty or the cost of misplaced trust or what it took him to stop measuring his worth by what he produced. He might go somewhere entirely unexpected. And notice what this question does that the earlier ones don't. It asks him to speak from accumulated understanding, not current feeling. It treats him as someone who has learned something worth sharing. And that is a form of respect that most conversations never offer. Most women never reach this place. Not because they aren't capable of it, but because the conversation never got deep enough to make it feel safe. You got here differently. And he can feel that distinction even if he couldn't name it. That's the shift. And once a conversation reaches this level, it doesn't go back to the surface. He doesn't want it to. Now here's something subtle but important. At this point in the conversation, if you've been genuinely present, if you've listened without rushing, if you've allowed space rather than filling it, something has already changed. He's not just talking to you, he's talking with you. And the difference between those two things is everything. This is where many women make one final mistake. They sense the connection and try to accelerate it, becoming warmer, more available, more eager. But what this moment actually calls for is steadiness. You stay calm. You stay curious. You let the connection breathe. Because attraction that builds slowly and quietly tends to last in a way that sudden intensity never does. Before we reach the final question, the one that asks about the space between where he is and where he senses he's supposed to be, the gap that is real for almost every man and almost never spoken, I want you to think about something. Not just what you're hearing, but whether you'd actually use it. Because information without application changes nothing. The next time you're in a conversation with someone you're genuinely interested in, instead of reaching for the next obvious question, ask yourself something different first. What has this person probably never been asked? That one shift alone will change everything about how you show up. Now we arrive at the final question, and in many ways, this is the one that brings everything together. You ask him, what does your life need more of right now that you haven't quite let yourself go after yet? And when you ask this, something moves. Not on the surface, but somewhere underneath. Because this question doesn't ask about the past or even the present. It asks about the space between where he is and where he senses he's supposed to be. That gap is real for almost every man. And it is almost never spoken. His answer might start simple. More time, more freedom, more creative space. But if you stay with it, if you explore it gently, it becomes something more revealing. He might be talking about permission. Just the freedom to want something different from what his life has required of him. He might be talking about rest. He might be talking about a version of connection he's been hoping for without knowing how to name it. And here's where everything you've learned connects. These 7 questions were never just about gathering information. They were about creating a specific kind of experience. One where he feels challenged, seen, and met at a depth most interactions never reach. And when you guide someone through that experience with genuine presence and calm curiosity, something happens that can't be faked or reversed. He doesn't just remember what you talked about. He remembers how it felt to talk with you. Let's pause here for a moment because this is important. Think about the people in your own life that you feel most connected to. It isn't the ones who impressed you most. It's the ones who, at some point, made you feel genuinely understood. They created a space where you didn't have to filter yourself, where what you said actually landed. That feeling is rare, and now think about being that for someone else. But here's the part that most people still get wrong. Knowing what to ask is one thing. Knowing how to carry the conversation after is what actually matters. Because these questions are not a checklist. They're not meant to be cycled through one after another like an interview. That would feel clinical. She would feel it. Think of them instead as doors. You open one. You step inside. You stay there long enough for something real to develop. And only when it feels natural, not when you decide it's time, do you move. For example, if he shares something meaningful about the gap between his life and how he wants to feel in it, you don't immediately introduce the next question. You stay. You might ask, what do you think that would feel like to actually close that gap? Now the conversation is no longer structured. It's alive. And when a conversation is alive, neither of you wants it to end. Here's something equally important. Intention. Because everything you've learned here only works if the curiosity behind it is real. If you're using these questions to create an effect, to manufacture something, he will feel it. Maybe not consciously, but emotionally. And when that happens, the connection doesn't deepen. It becomes hollow. But when your intention is genuinely to understand him, to see beyond the version he usually presents, everything changes. Your tone becomes more natural. Your presence becomes more grounded. And the conversation feels real because it is real. Now bring this back to yourself for a moment. Think about how you usually show up in conversations with someone you're genuinely interested in. Are you trying to be liked, or are you trying to understand? Are you focused on how you're coming across, or are you actually present with what's being said? Because the shift from performing to connecting is what changes everything. And when you make that shift consistently, something settles in you too. You stop feeling pressure. You stop measuring every word. You become more relaxed, more grounded, more naturally confident. Not because you're trying to be, but because you're no longer focused on managing how you're perceived. That's the real shift. And once it happens, it doesn't reverse. Here's a simple practice you can start immediately. In your next 3 conversations, with someone new or someone you already know, choose just one of these questions. Not all 7, just one. Ask it when the moment feels right. And then do something most people never do. Listen without interrupting. Don't turn it back to yourself too quickly. Don't rush to fill the silence. Just stay present with whatever comes. And afterward, notice what was different. Did the conversation feel more alive? Did he open up in a way he usually doesn't? Did something shift in how he looked at you? Because once you experience that shift, once you feel what a conversation can become when it reaches the right depth, you won't need to force anything anymore. It becomes the way you naturally move through connection. Now I want to know, which of these questions landed most for you? Which one do you feel would open the deepest door in your next real conversation? Tell me in the comments, because I read them and I genuinely want to hear what you're seeing. And if you've ever experienced a conversation that reached you in a way most don't, one that stayed with you long after it ended, share that too. Because those moments are worth understanding.